Welcome to the Ocean Forum. Prior to the opening of the program, Dr. Atsushi Tsunami, president of Sasakawa Peace Foundation and the president of OPRI, is going to welcome you.
皆さんこんばんは。笹川平和財団理事長、海洋政策研究所所長の須波敦です。
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Atsushi Tsunami, President of Sasakawa Peace Foundation and President of Ocean Policy Research Institute. State of emergency due to COVID has been declared and extended for Tokyo and other major urban areas in Japan. The situation remains difficult, but I'd like to express appreciation to medical healthcare providers and all other essential workers for their dedication to support our lives. I hope you will stay safe and healthy and overcome the difficulties we are facing. I'm pleased to welcome you to this year's first Ocean Forum. Perspectives from the frontline of IUU fishing, international partnership and challenges. We've decided not to suspend our research dialogue and other activities, but we are restrained by uncertainty and certain restrictions. I appreciate your understanding in this regard.
As you know, eliminating illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing is an important task for us to achieve a sustainable ocean and conserve marine resources and assure food security. The economic loss of IUU fishing is estimated to account for $23 billion annually, and it can be $8 billion in the Pacific region alone. The international community must reinforce its efforts by implementing the Port State Measures Agreement and related policy instruments and mechanisms. Japan adopted a new legislation last December called the Act for the Improvement of Domestic Trade and Specific Marine Animals and Plants Act as an effort to eliminate the seafood caught by IUU fishing in the Japanese market. I'm grateful that Mr. Urbina, an award-winning investigative journalist of the New York Times, is joining us today to give his talk and have a discussion with Japanese colleagues regarding IUU fishing and its ecological, socio-economic implications. I hope that today's discussion will further inspire us and reinvigorate our efforts to eliminate IUU fishing and strengthen international partnership. Our OPRI and Sasakawa Peace Foundation will continue to work with diverse stakeholders to tackle the challenges that our society faces by striving towards achieving peace and prosperity of the world, including stakeholder inclusiveness, gender equality, and a sustainable ocean. I thank you again for joining us today. I wish you all that the year 2021 will be fruitful to you. I look forward to furthering collaboration with you. Thank you.
Now I'd like to move on to the main part of the program. The moderator with us today is Masanori Kobayashi, Senior Research Fellow of the Ocean Policy Research Institute of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to you all. I'm Masanori Kobayashi, Senior Research Fellow of the Ocean Policy Research Institute of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. I welcome you all to the 178th Ocean Forum, Perspectives from the Frontline of IUU Fishing, International Partnership and Challenges. We have a distinct pleasure to welcome outstanding journalist Mr. Urbina, investigative reporter of the New York Times, who will tell us about what he has witnessed during his investigative reporting on IUU fishing around the world. After listening to his talk, we will have a panel discussions with 3 Japanese colleagues as well as a colleague of the Outlaw Ocean project. He is well known worldwide. His book Outlaw Ocean was published in English and translated into 9 other languages. The Japanese version of his book is forthcoming this May that we certainly look forward to. I remember 2 years ago when I went to Palau, I had a chance to visit a remote island called Kayangel, and I met a gentleman who was working there as a ranger to patrol coastal areas, and he was actually telling me about the visit of Ian to Kayangel at that time. So I was very surprised, and at the same time that also told me and tells us that he has traveled around the world to document IUU fishing. So may I invite Ian, and thank you indeed for joining us, to tell us about what was your motive to initiate and undertake your investigative reporting on IUU fishing. And I'm sure that you have a lot to tell us, but as we are located in Asia and the Pacific, maybe it would be good to hear more about your stories in Asia and the Pacific that are in our proximity. So may I invite Ian to take a floor and proceed with your talk. So Ian, please.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Thanks also for having me here today. So my plan will be to start with the big picture and offer a broad view at the outset about the Outlaw Ocean. What were its motives, its methodologies, its outcomes as a journalistic project. And then my goal would be to move to maybe 3 stories in particular that offer a bit of a sense for how these issues played out in our reporting. As was mentioned, I've been a journalist with the New York Times on staff for about 20 years. And my mandate as an investigative reporter is to find virgin snow, topically, to find topics, subject matter that either haven't been covered before or are old topics that can be approached in a new way, and ideally to find things that are broken in the world and shed light on them with the hope that that attention will help fix those things. And so the Outlaw Ocean started from that place, that mission, and in essence was an attempt to reimagine the part of the planet that is water, the 2/3 of the surface that is water, and to think of that space as a frontier, if you will, a realm where a lot happens, but we rarely hear much in the way of news from this realm, this watery frontier. And also to think about this space not just as a marine or environmental story, but also as a human story. To think of the oceans in the broadest sense of the world as the lungs of the planet, producing 50% of the air we breathe, a major source of protein for many coastal nations, a bustling workplace, where more than 50 million people work, and to some degree the circulatory system of the world's commerce, in the sense that 90% of the products we consume comes by way of ship and therefore is traversing this space. And yet the journalism about these people and about the activities and about the environmental story out there was woefully lacking. There was really good academic and advocacy work done on the oceans, but more often than not, it was only environmental in focus, and more often than not, it wasn't being covered in a narrative, investigative, evocative way in journalism that, in my view, drives change. So the goal was to approach journalistically the space. Now, IUU, illegal fishing, underreported, unregulated fishing, is certainly a part of that, but the view we had was that only by offering a bigger picture and framing IUU within the context of a broader diversity of crimes and placing it on a spectrum of other sorts of behaviors out there, only then would the public writ large, the global public, feel a sense of urgency, a sense of complicity, a sense of relevance to what's happening out there. Leaving this space as one that's largely defined by marine life only, or IUU stories strictly, was probably, in our view, not going to be enough to move the meter. So that was the ambition. Methodologically, the journalism, which again started for 2 years in the New York Times and then culminated in 2 more years of reporting at sea for the book, and then since then has been going on for additional, and is ongoing now, additional 2 years. This reporting all fits within the framework of a look at the sort of woeful lack of governance at sea and the sort of subsidiary consequences of that lack of governance. Why isn't there more governance out there? Why is policing what few laws exist? Why is policing of those laws so rare and difficult? And what are the diversity of nefarious behaviors out there? So alongside reporting about illegal fishing, which the stories focused on, we have stories of human slavery, often referred to as sea slavery, stories of repo men, or these individuals who steal ships on behalf of banks and mortgage loan companies, stories of seafarer abandonment, stories of bycatch, shark finning, stories of intentional dumping of oil and other forms of intentional pollution at sea, stories of armed trafficking, human trafficking, stories of murder of stowaway, stories of murder of people that are even caught on camera and yet no governments prosecute, a wide diversity of crimes. So these were the ambitions topically. Methodologically, the journalism meant to not report the stories on shore, but as much as possible, always report the stories at sea. So in other words, really take the extra effort to get onto the vessels and report on them so that you could give readers a more vicarious, five senses feel for what this world is like. So I would shift to say perhaps maybe we can talk about, or I can talk about 3 stories in particular, 2 that were part of the core original reporting in the book, and then 1 that we produced, we being me and my team, produced in the last year since the book. So first I'd like to touch on a story about Palau. Palau is, as many of you already know, is in some ways a quintessential island nation in that it's small, it's a developing nation, a small population. A lot of its domestic economy depends on tourism, and quite especially marine tourism. In the case of Palau, a lot of shark, scuba diving. So a very ocean-dependent nation, but also a nation that has a unusual skewing in the proportion of its land mass to its sea area. So Palau has the island and land territory of, to make a US reference, the city of Philadelphia. So a small US urban city on the one hand, but it has the sea space under its territorial jurisdiction of France, so a large European nation. And yet Palau for many years had only one patrol vessel to attempt to protect that huge seascape, to protect the marine life from illegal fishing, industrial fishing, often incursions by foreign industrial boats. Interestingly enough, a lot of support has come from Japan in particular, and Nippon Foundation, in trying to help Palau better police its waters. But in Palau, you had this standard challenge where they were under-equipped to actually protect their waters, but over-dependent on those very same waters for their protein source and for their economy. And they also were in a place in the world where they were a magnet for large fleets, Taiwanese, South Korean, Chinese, were routinely entering these waters with impunity and illegally. And so you had this David and Goliath kind of struggle in Palau, where the challenge of protecting those waters was severe. I wanted to tell the story of what it was like for the 17 officers who work that one patrol vessel in this sort of Sisyphean, impossible challenge of policing the waters. And also a good news story in the sense of Japan, Australia, the US, in terms of governments, a NGO called the Pew Charitable Trusts and some other NGOs, Nippon Foundation, had all come together to attempt to help Palau and other island nations better use alternate methods of policing, such as satellite technology, so that they could have a more targeted approach. Whenever there were incursions, it was possible to see, with help from what is still expensive satellite monitoring, the incursion. But the next steps were always the hard ones. Dispatching a ship so as to go engage that intruder was one option, an expensive, time-consuming, often ineffective option. But also figuring out how to alert the other nations where that ship that fishing vessel that had just entered Palauan waters was headed next, usually to unload their illegal catch. That sort of relationship building and work between the Palauan military and the Palauan government and other nations that were going to be complicit in the illegal fishing that was going on was something that took a lot of effort, building the relationships and the sort of protocol for providing evidence that could then convince these other governments to seize that ship or halt it from unloading its catch. And that sort of coalition building and that sort of reliance on other nations to tackle IUU was, I think, one of the most important lessons from the reporting in Palau. So Palau, I think, is the story of Kiribati, is the story of many island nations, Fiji, where they are up against severe challenges, and only with international help do they have any chance of countering the onslaught of illegal fishing. A second story line of reporting that's been ongoing is the story of the South China Sea, and more specifically of sea slavery as it existed in the Thai fleet on the South China Sea. And this, I think, is a hugely important issue. The problem of debt bonded or trafficked or captive or otherwise abused workers on fishing vessels, be they legal fishing vessels or illegal fishing vessels. But the human story within the distant water fishing fleets, and the very ingrained problems within that workforce that really, actually, it's hard to think of other global workforces that have conditions as bad as these distant water fishing fleets do. And I say that not bombastically. You look at some of the really good academic research that's been done on, for example, murder on distant water fishing fleets. There was a UN study from 2009 that interviewed Cambodian deckhands on Thai fishing vessels, and they found that 49% of those deckhands had directly witnessed murder of other crew. So I don't know that you can find another line of work that has these sorts of statistics. The Thai fleet in particular is one that we looked at, not because it's the only place where sea slavery exists, but because it's a particularly illustrative example. In the Thai fleet on the South China Sea, you have a couple of important factors. One is you have a fleet that has resisted mechanization, and it is woefully bloated. There are simply too many boats within the Thai fleet for healthy competition to exist. And so the competition between Thai vessels, even in nearshore waters, not to mention distant waters, is very acute. And that means the profit margins that are possible within that fleet are slimmer. And that means that when 40% of your overhead on a fishing vessel, especially on a distant water fishing vessel, is manpower, that's one of the few places where you can actually potentially cut corners and make savings. And in the Thai situation, the possibility of cutting the corners on labor costs are greater because you have in Thailand a middle-class country, less than 2% unemployment, surrounded by Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Vietnam, these other neighboring countries that have a lot of volatility and fairly extreme poverty. And therefore, huge amounts of young men and boys are heading out of those countries into Thailand looking for work. And that makes for a very ripe trafficking situation where a lot of those very desperate individuals end up on the fishing boats and often are working either for free or in a debt bonded situation. So in Thailand, the investigation was an effort to look at the labor conditions that overlap and intersect with illegal fishing and legal fishing. And again, I would emphasize you can find these same problems in vessels off the coast of Ghana, off the coast of the Falkland Islands, off the coast of New Zealand. You have similar problems, but in Thailand, it's especially pervasive. This reporting began in the New York Times and continues presently, and really is important in its connection with IUU in the sense that you have all sorts of less dramatic crimes, but equally consequential crimes embedded in the same vessels. So document fraud, bribery, corruption, money laundering. Sea slavery and illegal fishing cannot occur without those prerequisite white collar or white paper crimes. And if you talk with folks from Interpol, for example, they're always quick to emphasize that until nations take those other crimes seriously and actually put budget toward the investigators and prosecutors and lawyers and academic research that's required to really figure out what to do about those sorts of crimes, tackling the more dramatic crimes such as human trafficking or murder or illegal fishing are going to be very difficult because they all rest on these other sorts of crimes. And in the Thai fleet, especially their distant water vessels, say near Bangladesh or Somalia, where we looked, you see these core white-collar crimes, as well as the challenges of flags of convenience and the ease with which vessels that are involved in bad behavior can change their identity and then sort of walk away from any sort of accumulated bad reputation. These are all prerequisite crimes that need to be focused on, and we're part of that overall reporting. The last sort of line of reporting that I'll just touch on briefly, and ideally all of these topics will queue up a more lively Q&A session because I can go more deeply into them, is a line of reporting that took about a year and a half to produce, and some members of the panel were actually involved in the dissemination of this reporting. But this was a story that you might say began with two vexing mysteries. One was the mystery of that Japan knows well, which was why are so many North Korean fishing boats washing onto Japanese shores, often with dead bodies on board? What is the cause of those vessels arriving in Japan, and why have those numbers steadily been increasing over the last years? And the second mystery was, why has there been this sharp decline? The numbers, the estimates vary depending on where you are, but the estimates are that anywhere from 60 and 80%, a very sharp decline in squid stock in the Sea of Japan, also called East Sea by some, but Sea of Japan, why have the squid stock seen such a sharp decline? Now, there were going theories and very solid academic research to back those theories as to what drove those things. And the big takeaways were on the question of the dead bodies washing up and the ghost boats washing up onto Japanese shores. The large driver was, possibly worsened by sanctions put on North Korea, but for whatever reason, the food shortage in North Korea, there was growing pressure being placed by the North Korean government on the fishing sector within that country. And so fishermen were being pushed to achieve higher quotas of catch and take more risks, not to mention more untrained individuals, especially from the military, were being put on boats and sent out to sea. These combination of factors meant that fishermen were at a higher rate getting stranded at sea, and more often, being overturned by storms. Their dirty fuel and the engine breaks down. Any number of factors occur. Those boats get stranded, and the individuals freeze to death or drown or starve to death, and the vessel, due to the currents, ends up washing ashore in Japan. Not an incorrect theory, probably right, but not the only variable. On the other mystery, why are we seeing this drop of the squid stock? Again, whether the drop is real, whether it's perceived, whether the migration patterns of the squid are changing due to climate change, all these things are, being more rigorously tackled by researchers and academics, many of them in Japan. But clearly one of the variables was what we began researching, which was there had long been, from Japanese fishermen and from South Korean fishermen, anecdotal reporting about the presence of large numbers of Chinese boats, fishing vessels, squid fishing vessels that were crossing Japanese and South Korean waters and heading into North Korean fishing grounds. This was a really important and troubling issue, quite especially after 2017, at which point there was a set of UN sanctions placed on North Korea in response to nuclear testing. And part of those sanctions explicitly forbade foreign fishing in North Korean waters. That set of sanctions was signed unanimously by the UN Security Council, of which China obviously is a member, and yet there was anecdotal evidence that large numbers of Chinese vessels were still entering North Korean waters. Whether the North Korean government was aware of it and actually selling those licenses still to the Chinese, or whether they weren't, is somewhat irrelevant, frankly, because in either case, it was patently illegal vis-a-vis those sanctions. And the challenge from a reporting perspective that we had was to work with the academics, Japanese, South Korean, American, and others, who had used a partnership with an organization called Global Fishing Watch to leverage satellite information and attempt to essentially put dots on a map and quantify the number of vessels that were entering North Korean waters. Those Chinese vessels were entering those waters, typically turning off their transponders and going dark, becoming invisible to on-land authorities. But through this coalition of academics and Global Fishing Watch, there were alternate ways to lay eyes on the vessels. And it turns out that the numbers were quite shocking, to the tune of 700 to 900 Chinese vessels in any given year. And that's when we at the Outlaw Ocean Project got involved. And the hope journalistically was to put a story behind those dots on the map and also ground truth what the data seemed to be indicating. So we took a team to South Korea, paid our way onto a South Korean squid fishing vessel, went out to key coordinates where it was most likely going to be the case that we would see, some number of passing Chinese vessels heading toward and ultimately into North Korean waters, and just witness it firsthand, and also film it, so that we could tell a story about this research. And that's just what we did. We chronicled. We stayed there for a while. We're able to eventually lay eyes on a group of 10 Chinese vessels that were indeed heading into North Korean waters. We followed them for a while, documented them, took as much information from what we could by being close to them, put a drone up over them so that we could film them from lots of different angles. And then things became very tense. One of the lead vessels in that convoy split off and sort of approached us in an aggressive way, and we decided it was probably best that we peel off and head back to port. But this was a story that I think did a bunch of things. One, it showed that IUU often is not an isolated crime. There are ancillary and connected and causally related crimes that involve humans, such as these dead bodies washing ashore. The new theory that came out of this research was that while climate change likely is a key factor in the declining squid stock, the presence of 700 to 900 industrial squid vessels is probably also playing an important role. And the presence of those vessels are also, those Chinese vessels in North Korean waters are also likely playing a key role in North Korean fishing boats having to go further from shore to perilous, distances and taking greater risks that were culminating more often in these deadly incidents of fishermen dying. So this was kind of a textbook example of what we set out to do journalistically: work with academics, work with other types of firms such as Global Fishing Watch and NGOs, use data, but take the data and try to tell stories so that average non-academic consumers of the information would understand it and it would compel them to pay attention to these issues. And then also work with news outlets around the world, translate the reporting into multiple languages, and try to disseminate it more broadly than I had previously done when I was strictly at the New York Times. And this was a real success, quite frankly, in terms of these ambitions. So these are just three of the types of stories that we've been involved with that overall set of goals. Again, ultimately trying to report at sea, trying to show the intersectionality of the human and the environmental concerns occurring out there, and also trying to tell the stories in more creative, broader ways, and ultimately highlighting the various ways in which nearshore national waters or high seas international waters suffer, and we all suffer as a result from an overall lack of governance. So I'll just end there, and perhaps we can open it up to questions.
Thank you, Ian, for very comprehensive talks about. I really understood that IUU fishing is very complex, and it's just not one single crime, but it's also linked to a range of other crimes and also social issues like poverty and income disparity. And you also mentioned this UN Security Council sanctions have also something to do with the illegal fishing in the Sea of Japan. I also understood that to tackle this, we have to really have an international coalition. It's not just one single country fending off the IUU fishing vessels, but the neighboring countries also have to keep close eyes and make sure that the IUU fishing vessels are not offloading their IUU fishing called seafood in their market. We tend to think that IUU fishing is something that is happening far away from our country, but as you mentioned that it's one of the IUU fishing you have observed was actually taking place between China, North Korea, South Korea, and Japan. So we are also situated very close to some of the hotspot or suspicious areas of IUU fishing. So I'm just wondering, you have done this reporting for over the years, and maybe things may be also changing, and you're also getting some reactions from your readers and audience, and there are also some policy development afterwards, probably thanks to your reporting. International communities woke up and took an actions to legislate some policy measures. So how do you see the changes that have been taking place over the last few years, in particular, in response to your reporting, and also maybe the reactions you are getting from your international audience and the readers of your book regarding your IUU finding? Can you elaborate on these elements?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough thing to know for any journalist to honestly figure out what is a direct connection to their reporting. At best, you get small glimpses, usually through interactions with different types of stakeholders that come to you and ask for input or guidance. And those are the moments when you think, oh, well, I'm having an impact. There are, isolated stories that have very tangible and concrete outcomes. So, in the case of the sea slavery reporting, for example, we highlighted, we sort of used as a poster child narrative the case of a Cambodian man named Lang Long, who had been shackled by the neck for a long period. He was at sea for 2 years and sold boat to boat, and when he wasn't fishing, he was shackled. By putting that story out on the front page of the New York Times and then staying with it for the subsequent 4 years, the concrete results were those captains were arrested, they've been prosecuted, that individual, was sort of taken under the wing of the government and helped with funding and mental health services. And there was an overall reaction beyond that case from the EU vis-a-vis its relationship with Thailand and its grading system, whether it was a red card, a yellow card, or a green card in terms of imports. Those are multi-million-dollar consequences for the nation of Thailand. So that one story really became a centerpiece in for the nation of Thailand and its commerce, but also for the individual of Lang Long and his life. And similarly, there are other isolated stories. We had a murder investigation that began in 2014 that only a month ago, this was 7 individuals who were killed on camera by private security guards on Taiwanese tuna longliners. And this was all, captured and documented, but it took a good 6 years of pressure, journalistic pressure, to get the Taiwanese government to arrest, charge, and 2 weeks ago convict that captain of those crimes. On IUU issues, it's much murkier. You see small movement. It's in the form of a phone call from Bumblebee Tuna, an American company seeking to have a confidential discussion about things that they're trying to do within their supply chain so that they can better ensure that they're not associated with IUU or other crimes. It might be a request from a congressional office to testify on these issues. It's questions from editors and journalists in other venues that are now wanting to do more stories along these lines. It's regular emails and calls from organizations or individuals who have read these things and want to change their buying habits. These are the sort of small and large but ongoing indications that someone's paying attention. But whether it all adds up is hard to say.
Thank you, Ian. And I really see the connections between the your reporting and maybe the enhanced international awareness and the call for making changes to eliminate IUU fishings and probably relieve some of those that are trapped in IUU fishing and bring justice to these areas. And yeah, I really think that you have made a tremendous achievement and contributions to that effect. I should pay a tribute to that. Another thing I was wondering was that, the judging from what I have been hearing from you, it doesn't seem like individuals just doing illegal fishing by themselves, but they are rather trapped in a kind of much broader institutional framework that operating based on some economic incentives or commercial interest or maybe political interest as well. And I just wondered if you can also touch upon this structural aspect that behind possibly the IUU fishing that you have witnessed. Can I ask you to make comment on that aspect?
I mean, I think if I understand the thinking correctly, the question is, can we get up to an even higher altitude of analysis where we think of meta factors that help contribute to the problem of IUU? And at that altitude, I would think, number one, you have the sort of nature of globalized marketplace, whereby you have seafood that is being caught in one place, packaged in another, sort of offloaded in a third, and shipped to a fourth. For a long time, the supply chain that a company might use to accomplish that task would be vertical, and the company would often own the vessels, the cold storage where they're kept when they come to shore, the processing facilities, the trucks that then transport them, the canneries, etc. That day has long since passed due to globalization, and now most supply chains, and quite especially seafood, is rarely owned in a vertical fashion, which may be by design. It's certainly more price efficient for companies to outsource that to other specialized partners. It also makes, though, the ability for governments or academics to actually track those supply chains so much harder, because there are all these different players involved. And that fractured nature of seafood supply chains is one of the biggest challenges that I think has emerged in the last 2 decades. I think switching entirely to other drivers of IUU, you do have geopolitical factors involved in some places. So, for example, if you look at the Chinese fleet in particular, to some degree, it is engaged in fishing, right? Fishing vessels are fishing, and that's what they are meant to do. And they're not nefarious, nor is the Chinese government nefarious. They are motivated by self-interest in much the same way that the U.S. government, as an imperial power, has been for decades. So I don't mean to pass some sort of racist judgment about the distinct movement here, but the Chinese government is attempting to, on the one hand, establish more control over certain protein sources for its rapidly growing population, and rely less on others and more on itself, so that it can produce enough food to feed its own population as that population grows. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it is one of the drivers in the subsidized and bloated nature of its fishing fleet. The other driver, though, is the use of fishing vessels as geopolitical pawns that are actually doing other things. So if you look at the South China Sea and you look at the number of fishing vessels in certain places there, and then you actually look at the research of academics who've watched to see if those fishing vessels engage in fishing, and it turns out they don't, then you have to ask, what are they doing there? And what they're doing is creating certain facts on the ground, if you will. They're establishing precedent. They're establishing occupation. So that in years to come, they can say, we have been, for centuries, for decades and for years recently a robust presence in those waters, and therefore we should have rights to the access to the subsoil mineral wealth, oil and gas, or the throughway rights of commercial vessels that want to pass in those regions, et cetera, et cetera. And so those are geopolitical plays where fishing vessels are not actually, sort of achieving to get food and protein source, but rather they're doing other types of work. And that's I think a meta-structural factor involved in some of the IUU activity that you see.
Thank you, Ian. I see this complex issue again, the supply chains and also geopolitical issues and also commercial interests, and then not just to fisheries, but also like mineral resources or oil and gas in the seabed areas. So I thank you for putting up that kind of spectrum of all the issues interlinked with IUU fishing. And then maybe the last questions from me before we move on to the panel discussion will be about this supply chain. When you discuss it, this aquaculture is also quite important. And when we look at this Asia, Pacific and Indian Ocean and maybe Africa, they are also closely interlinked vis-a-vis this seafood supply chain, including aquaculture products. Did you witness anything about issues related to aquaculture or discussing this sustainability in fishery and aquacultures, possibly Asia, Pacific, Indian Ocean, and Eastern African coast?
Yeah, I mean, I think the story of aquaculture is a fascinating one because at its core, or at least the part of the story that really interests me quite recently, is the part of the story that is best intentions, worse consequences, sort of. And by that I mean, for a long time, aquaculture, and to some degree still, aquaculture was seen as a method for slowing ocean depletion, for controlling the rate at which the world's seas were running out of fish, wild-caught fish. And the thought here on a simplistic level was, if we can raise fish on our own in a farmed sort of capacity, near shore or in onshore pens, then we will have to catch fewer of them from the wild. And that will give the wild a chance to replenish. And there's some logic to it, but then the problems emerge. The well-known problems with aquaculture are the same problems that emerged when you began doing industrial scale, livestock penning. You put lots of chickens or pigs or cows in a gigantic pen. You have difficulties. Number one, keeping them healthy. And so you have to start relying more on antibiotics because they're too close together in an unhealthy capacity. You have the emissions and runoff problems of their waste. That becomes a major concern. And you also have the sort of market pressures to fatten them up faster, right? So industry begins feeding them things to get them to come to market sooner. Okay, take the cow and the pig and the chicken story and now move it onto the water, and you have the same problems. You have a waste problem with aquaculture, you have a feeding problem with aquaculture, you have a fattening up problem with aquaculture, and you have an antibiotics problem, right? And among other problems. And so the problem that interested me with aquaculture was this feeding problem, especially since what has emerged in the aquaculture market is sort of high protein pelletized source of fattening up of the fish. Used to be soy based, and in the last decade has moved largely over to fish meal, which, as you know, is wild caught fish ground up into high protein powder or pellets that are then fed to farmed fish, which makes no sense, right? If you think of the original motivation was to slow down the capture of wild caught, but you're now catching wild caught fish to feed them to farmed fish, you've got a really problematic cycle. And that is the irony of one of the ironies of aquaculture. And how this plays out globally is you have places like Gambia in West Africa, which is where I spent a fair amount of time on patrols looking at this issue. And again, not to demonize the Chinese, but they are the biggest player out there on the seas. And so often you run into them. And in Gambia, the major players of industrial foreign fishing on those waters are Chinese and Taiwanese and some South Korean. Those vessels are largely catching forage fish, which is fish that typically is smaller than is marketable for human consumption. And when they're catching this fish in large quantities, grinding them up and pelletizing them into fish meal that they then ship back to China and export. Either they feed to aquaculture in China or they're exporting to Norway and the US and EU and other places for aquaculture in those places. And the consequence for Gambians is severe, because for ages, there's a fish called bonga fish, B-O-N-G-A, which was so plentiful in Gambian waters, and it was such a staple that when you went to the market in Gambia, you could get bonga for free. You know, it was something you got on the side of other things you might purchase because it was so cheap. And now bonga are being captured, ground up, and made into fish meal, and local Gambians can't afford bonga because the price of it is so high because it's all going into fish meal factories. And what that's doing is destabilizing the food security of a developing nation, namely Gambia, where now you have Gambians are largely getting their protein from imported chicken. Where? From China. So you have this crazy cycle in which you have Gambians buying chicken that's shipped to Gambia rather than eating bonga, which is in their own waters, because that's getting ground up and exported back to China. And this is just an example of one of the dark ironies of the global seafood market.
Thank you. I really see this complexity again about these fisheries and the fish meal for aquaculture, and also like a chicken import export between across the continent. And I thank you for highlighting that aspect as well. And yeah, I rather love to continue, but at the same time, I also like to listen to other Japanese experts and see what would be their reactions to your talks. And may I just invite 3 Japanese colleagues to turn on your cameras. And the first person I'd like to introduce is Mr. Tetsuji Ida. He's a very distinguished and leading journalist of the Kyodo News Agency based in Japan. And he has extensive coverage of environment and the sustainability issues, including eel and seafood and the fishery as well. So may I invite Mr. Ida just to tell us, how did you see the significance of Ian's reporting? And he also spoke about this illegal fishings taking place in the Sea of Japan between the 4 countries in Northeast Asia. Can I invite Mr. Ida to present your views on the issues that Ian just presented? Mr. Ida, please.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me, and this is my great honor to be one of the members of this panelist of this great discussion. I once worked with Ian. I made a news story is based on his activities of his research done by together with Global Fishing Watch. That the stories on the Chinese fishing boat activity, IUU activities in the North Korean waters. And the most interesting things for me was he showed me a connection that he told us before that he showed me a connection between the IUU activities and so many North Korean small boat, and ending up with Japanese coast, and we found so many dead bodies of poor fishermen from North Korea. It's that kind of connection is very interesting and very important for me. I think I've been reporting environment issue for more than 30 years, and also I visited many places, and I also always find that the environment destruction come together with human rights violation, and the forest destruction and farm oil or rubber plantation. Also, there are activities like that Ian showed us. So there we needed to see that fact. Not only we needed to focus on not only for the environment destruction. We should not forget the other aspect that the severe human rights violation come together with that. And we don't forget that forest people will be a first victim of environment destruction, like the poor North Korean fishermen end up with Japanese coasting and hit. And that is one of the important activities done by Ian. And also, I know that I made some report on IUU activities and like in many countries, but I would say that what's happening on the sea is very invisible, and as a journalist, it's very hard to make visible. And the interesting thing for me is there are, as a Global Fishing Watch, and more sophisticated IT technology and satellite technologies contribute to make it visible. I think there are to make visible what's happening in the high seas or on the environment destruction on the sea and the human rights violation. We needed to have sophisticated technology like Global Fishing Watch, and we needed to have the eminent journalists like Ian, and also NGO should be involved, and more researchers should be involved, and to make these things much more visible to the public. That first comment and impression I got today's talk from Ian.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ida, and also highlighting these linkages between IUU fishing and the poverty, and also I think Ian also articulated that it's not so easy to report on what is happening in the oceans. It's far away and very invisible to some extent, yeah, we can use satellite data, etc. But I think Ian has been trying to create a kind of human stories about people who are trapped in the IUU fishing or operating in the IUU fishing sectors, so that probably make it more costly or expensive for your operation as well to cover what is happening on the oceans. Any reactions from Ian to the comment made by Mr. Ida?
No, I mean, look, Mr. Ida and I knew each other prior to this panel because we worked together on that very story. And in some ways, it's one of the best things about the story in the sense that it shows, number one, that the internet has allowed collaborations, efficient collaborations like this one that previously were tough to do. And now, if there's trust and communication, you can take a story that we produced in the U.S. and work with Kyodo News, and we have worked with them subsequently. So I think that's key. I think the other thing that's key is, again, as a former academic myself, I do think that there isn't often enough collaboration between academics and journalists, and it's a scary thing for both sides because they come from different professions, and they have their own timetables and language and all these sorts of things. But if you can find and really work towards overlapping, like was the case here, where the academic publication was in a peer-reviewed journal, it took a lot of work and a lot of waiting for that vetting to occur, which is appropriate to the academic realm. They had faith in our side to abide by the embargo and not push our story out until they had their work done, but they also knew that we were going to do our own independent reporting and have different sets of priorities. And that, I think, is essential and should happen more often. And again, the international nature of the academics themselves, the Japanese, South Korean, Russian, American, all these folks working together on a shared goal. So there were a lot of things that were really amazing about that reporting that I hope we can replicate.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with Ian that more independent researchers should be involved in this kind of project to make things much more visible, and also it can make the things much more reliable.
Thank you. Thank you for touching on this importance of collaboration between academia and the journalists. I think that this is very important, and also an important message to us as well.
And so the NGOs should be involved.
Yeah.
And the NGOs, yes.
And
so let me just invite Ms. Yoko Tamura, the representative of the Global Marine Consulting based in Ishigaki, Okinawa, Japan. She's quite familiar with, for instance, Marine Stewardship Council certifications and the sustainability fisheries. So looking at these IUU issues from this ensuring sustainability in the fisheries, may I invite Tamura-san to tell us your views and the reactions to Ian's talks. Tamura-san, please.
Thank you for introduction, and thank you, Ian, for revealing such striking stories from the most front line of the news and making it available to the public. So I'm an independent fisheries consultant for sustainable fisheries, and I've been working on MSC fisheries assessment for the past 7 years. So I'd like to make comments, actually 2 comments on the perspectives of the fisheries and the IUU. So firstly, I'd like to comment that because of the increased reports like yours, there has been more awareness on the IUU fisheries recently compared to the past. So the MSC actually made a new requirement from the 2019 that every fishery certified should declare its policy for forced labor and child labor, and it will be posted online and available to public on the MSC website. And throughout the traceability chain, also the third-party auditor will check that every seller and buyer who's dealing with a product will be free from the IUU fisheries or consistent with the policy. So at least the consumer can be ensured that the products are screened for the IUU fishery. And it's a small step, I know, but at least it's making a progress. And the second point that I want to make is that the MSC assessment actually requires that the assessment covers the whole stock level. So not only the management in one area, but if the fish moves out of the jurisdiction, then we have to check the other management if that is really sustainable, so that the entire stock sustainability will be ensured. And this presents an important challenge for Japan because many important commercial species for Japan are widely distributed species, and now they are more and more caught by the other nations like China and Korea, who's catching just outside of the EEZ. And actually there is an international body of the management to cover that. And as you know, the NPFC, the North Pacific Fisheries Commission, is tasked to manage those regionally distributed fisheries stock in the North Pacific. And all or most of the major commercial fishing nations are already the member of the commission, like the Japan, Korea, China, and Russia, America. So it is really the effectiveness of this NPFC that is a question. So taking an example of the squid, in Japan, there's this annual stock assessment for squid, but it doesn't consider the catch of the IUU. So there's uncertainty, big uncertainty for the stock status. So I believe that the strengthening of the function and management of the NPFC is one of the important aspects in dealing with the IUU fisheries in Japan. And also it has a big stake for Japan to gain any MSC certification for those commercial species distributing widely.
Thank you. I think you have really addressed a very important point of that the MSC is certainly one instrument to eliminate IUU fishing, or at least inform the consumers of the sources of the seafoods. But it also depends on the market conditions. Maybe the areas where Ian is there, you may see more product with MSC certified products, or even Europe. But in Japan, it may be slightly limited. So the penetration of MSC in the market differ from region to the regions. The other point, I think she also mentioned a very important part, this regional fishery management organizations for the Pacific, North Pacific Fishery Commission is tasked to manage the seafood fishery stocks in the region. So nonetheless, this squid is not necessarily covered by the effective policies or management tools yet. So we see this kind of policy gaps there. And I just wonder if Ian can comment on this MSC and regional fishery management organizations task and responsibility.
No, I think you made really good points. It's often, if you think of a metaphor that moves us out of the fisheries language and into the language that everyone else uses, imagine you're in a country where the police are only supposed to be watching for illegalities from blue trucks, not all trucks, and not any color truck, and not sedans or other vehicles, but just blue trucks. I mean, that would make no sense. You would want to give the police the jurisdiction and the responsibility to cover all vehicles, trucks, cars, but instead regional fisheries management organizations often have very slivers of what they are allowed and responsible to do. And number one, you have the problem of there are all sorts of types, as you rightly point out, types of the very creature they're supposed to be watching over that don't fit. And then number two, the creatures are moving across their jurisdiction oftentimes, and so they can enter or leave. And this is the core, one of many core challenges I think that you pointed out with RFMOs. And then, whether it's MSC, so, certification regimes, or RFMOs, there are also the categories of challenges that exist on the water. So transshipment, right? Even if you had the best police force mechanism there, and they had full jurisdiction, and they were funded, and all these things, you then have the problem of keeping track of what those players on the water are actually doing is distinctly difficult, because they may be moving their cargo over, they could be throwing bycatch overboard and bringing new catch. And so even the best MSC or RFMO has a difficult job. So I just would amplify the points that you made.
Thank you, Ian. And I think there's a kind of merit in really looking into this further improvement or development of RFMOs and their operations in the regions. And yes, this fish stocks moves around. If it goes over the jurisdiction areas, then there may be another loophole as well. So this is maybe the areas that the journalists, practitioners, and researchers can work together to see how we can really improve the mechanisms under which the different type of the RFMOs and the certification schemes can actually perform to eliminate IUU fishings and promote the fishery sustainability. Any remarks from Tamura-san, just to add to supplement to your comment?
Well, thank you so much for your comments. Yes, that's really true that, currently, like outside of EEZ, we are not considering any catch in a stock assessment in Japan. So, that's really a problem. And also, you work with Global Fishing Watch a lot, and government is actually also, I think they are partially working with the Global Fishing Watch, so they do have the data. They are just not so, open and explicit that, they're not, they're working with them and they can use the data, and then, they want to be more preservative to have, to make sure that, they're okay to use the data with more precise way. So that kind of things also slows down. So yeah, but the tools are increasing, so that's really good.
Yeah. So the collaboration with NGOs and the application of satellite data, for instance, by the Global Fishing Watch, maybe also the opening up a kind of further ways to address this IUU fishing and seafood sustainability. So let me turn to next panelist, Professor Chisako Masuo of the Kyushu University. She has specializations in the Northeast Asia and China policy, in particular China. I think it was also reported that the new legislations came into effect early this month to allow the Chinese Coast Guards to exercise further duties to monitor their ocean as well. And people are anxious what would be the implications of that legislations. And as it was highlighted a number of times today, that China plays a very important role in eliminating IUU fishing and promoting sustainable fisheries, and maybe making sure that sustainable development, including the human rights protections and poverty eradications, marine resource and environment conservations will be also achieved. So may I invite Professor Masuo tell us your views in response to the Ian's comments and the talks, in particular in the light of the recent policy development by the countries such as China. So Professor Masuo, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Ian. I really enjoyed your very interesting, very intense stories about IUU. I myself is not a specialist on this issue, and I learned a lot from you. I myself has been studying Chinese foreign policy for many years, and then recently I'm a little bit interested in Chinese fishing policy. So from this perspective, I would like to make my comment. Listening to Ian's story, I hit an idea that there might be two types of IUU fishing. One is the one made by uncontrolled vessels. There are, as you have mentioned, there are many governments that do not have capability to control its own their own waters, and there are many people who are motivated to go for IUU fishing for their own economic interests. So probably that's the traditional type of IUU fishing. However, probably there is another type of IUU fishing made by controlled fishing vessels. I say this, I point this out because I think there is a possibility that Chinese authority intentionally operate this type of fishing. Today's within your talk, probably Palau and Thai case fits into this the first type, and maybe the Japan Sea falls onto the second type. If I can introduce the case of Chinese fishing policy, China has been putting a lot of emphasis on sustainability of its fishing operation recently, especially after 2016, when the final ruling of PCA, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, was given, and the claim was made by Philippines, as we all know, and then the ruling criticized China's reclamation in the South China Sea, and then it also criticized China saying that China was making a huge harms to the environmental situations in the South China Sea. So the next year, in 2017, China actually initiated a new fishing reform. In earlier days, China didn't control its fishing vessels seriously. However, it totally shifted its attitudes toward the fishing vessels, and then it started to reduce the number of fishing vessels and also their powers, and then also started to cut off the fish catch for about 30%, so that they can reduce the pressure on the sea. The fishing resources in their so-called jurisdiction water, that includes basically the water within the first island chain. And then I started to control its ports. In earlier days, all the Chinese fishing vessels could enter into any ports and then unload their fishing fish catch, so that they can maximize. They can choose the ports to unload the fish, and where they can which market they want to sell, so to increase their gains. However, after that, they had to they can only apply their fishing licenses, and they could to have their own mother, to have only one mother port. And once they go into the ports, they're strictly controlled by the local authorities. And then also the Beito satellite system was enhanced. China started to install China started to use Beito satellite system to control its fishing vessels starting from 2006. They called the the system VMS, vessel monitoring system, but Chinese VMS only operates on the Beidou satellite system. I think they used to operate. They could operate using the using GMS, but nowadays they only use Beidou, and then. This had been developed very well. It's a perfect system. Through this, through Chinese VMS, Chinese fishermen can contact the authorities anytime. And of course, the authorities can contact the fishing vessels anytime. And of course, the licensed vessels cannot turn off the Beidou satellite system. So unlike the fishing vessels turning off the GMS or AIS signals when they enter Japan Sea, Chinese authority can see where those vessels, where those Chinese vessels are anytime. And last year, last November, Chinese authority has publicized white paper, promise white paper, they call it, on the offshore fishing. When they talk about offshore fishing, it's about the Chinese fishing operation outside their jurisdiction water. So the Pacific, if those vessels are in the Pacific Ocean or if they're operating in the Arctic Ocean, it is all included in the in this white paper. But according to this white paper, the Chinese authority is controlling the fishing operation, offshore fishing operation of Chinese vessels for 100%. So I would like to invite Ian what you think of this, my sudden idea that I hit upon listening to your stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Masuo, and she highlighted this globalizing nature of the Chinese fishery operations and also the availability of high-tech in the Chinese authorities and also fishing vessels. And maybe there's a question of this political will about how they can actually reinforce this elimination of IUU fishing. So I just wondered if Ian has any reactions to the comments made by Professor Masuo.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the thing that caught my attention most about those insightful substantive comments are this point, and for the lay audience, about AIS versus VMS, two main methods that various players use to keep track of where ships are. And as was said, VMS is the method that is harder to turn off, and it's hardwired on the ship, but it's also more private, and only the government players can see that data unless the government, like Indonesia, decides to share it. If it is indeed the case, which I don't doubt based on what the professor said, that China has 100%, that seems to me doubtful, but a really high percent of its vessels are VMS wired, and indeed the VMS data they're getting is global, then that changes the playing field on the politics of their historical response about many things. One is, if you look at the UN body that monitors the sanctions on the Sea of Japan, there have been year in, year out, anonymously provided, most likely by the Japanese government and the South Korean government, complaints about these Chinese vessels entering North Korean waters. And they're right there in writing, documented reports asking the UN body to do something about it.
Thank you, Ian. Can I proceed, or does Professor Masuo has anything to add to respond?
China has been very proud. I mean, Xi Jinping government has been very proud of their achievement to have improved fishing control, fishing vessel controls. And last year, I saw many news released by Chinese local authorities to demolish the unlicensed vessels. Previously, they were missioned to have complete control over their local vessels. They have to catch the illegal, no license vessels. So they did that to demolish those catched vessels all over China. I think nowadays many unlicensed fishing vessels cannot come back to China because ports are already digitally controlled by the authority. So there is, I think there could be cases where Chinese vessels could not go back to China, so they had to be maybe sold to foreign partners, or they had to move their mother ports so that they can keep operation there, but they are their base, their operation base cannot come back to China. But maybe the local company can still make some money. So in that case, those vessels may not belong to the Chinese control anymore.
Thank you. I now have a pleasure to introduce Ms. Charlotte Norsworthy, Director at Outlaw Ocean LLC. Thank you for being with us, and can you tell us your plan and aspirations to advance your project Outlaw Ocean and shed a light on IUU fishing and the enhanced awareness and international actions to eliminate IUU fishing?
Thank you for that question. So we actually have a lot of exciting upcoming projects for the Outlaw Ocean project. We are really prioritizing in 2021 reaching a global and diverse audience. One way that we've been doing that is through a relatively new project called the Outlaw Ocean Music Project, which is a project that joins together more than 400 artists from more than 80 countries all over the world, and they produce music in a range of genres ranging from hip hop to instrumental to electronic. And we collaborate with them. We extend all of our reporting materials, all of the materials that Ian collected over the course of 5 years of reporting at sea. Lots of really gritty and fantastic audio pieces that these artists will incorporate into their own music, and that enables them to reach their own personal audience. So in doing so, by partnering with all of these musicians, we are expanding our reach for the Outlaw Ocean project, and that includes Japan. And so our priority going into 2021 is to continue expanding that reach, prioritizing places like the Global South, and continuing to spread awareness about these issues of lawlessness at sea. We're also continuing to report on investigative stories. We have our most recent investigation is going to be coming out in just a couple of weeks with the New Yorker, and we will continue reporting on that recent story, which is going to be based in the Gambia. So we have a lot of really great projects in store for 2021. Obviously, with COVID and with the pandemic, we've been stunted a little bit in terms of the progress that we've wanted to make, but we've been really excited with the progress that we've been able to make in 2020 and continue to build upon that momentum going into the new year. So really exciting stuff, and something that we will continue to prioritize is reaching a global audience, trying to spread awareness of these issues in a diverse and innovative fashion. So that is the sort of projects that I oversee at Synesthesia Media and at the Outlaw Ocean Project, is our sort of innovative strategies and continuing to think about ways that we can reach people in the way that they want to be reached. That includes publishing our content in dozens of countries and dozens of languages, including that of music. So we're very excited to continue to think about journalism and specifically these ocean issues in an innovative way.
And unfortunately, we are already running out of time, or we are going over the agreed time. And I have a few questions I have received, and I wanted to flag them before I solicit your final remarks to conclude this. I just wanted to mention that this Port State Measures Agreement adopted at the FAO conference is one of the central interinstitutional policy centerpiece for eliminating IUU fishing. And nonetheless, major countries haven't yet been parties to this Port State Measures Agreement. So this international policy framework hasn't yet been honored in order to eliminate IUU fishing. So how can we really accelerate the universal ratification and accessions to the Port State Measures Agreement? This is one question. The second is these subsidy issues. I think Ian mentioned these subsidies are also playing a role in tolerating this IUU fishing, and the WTO, World Trade Organizations, has long-lasting negotiations, but coming close to the final agreement that people are expecting. So for subsidy issues, how can we really make sure that the phasing out of all the subsidies that can contribute to IUU fishing or overfishing? This is the second question. And the last point is transparency. I think information's disclosure, information sharing is also important, and the stakeholder involvement. And I think Ian highlighted a number of times this collaboration between journalists, academias, and practitioner NGOs. They probably help enhancing transparency and also stakeholders' involvement in eliminating IUU fishings. So these are the kind of questions that I have received, and I wondered if each one of you can try to make last remarks, hopefully in 1 minute, just to conclude our discussion. So may I start with Ian? Maybe we will come back to you after listening to 3 other colleagues, but can I invite Ian to say some words on these elements?
Sure. 3 topics, 60 seconds to cover them, so 20 seconds per topic. So Port State Measure Agreement, it doesn't work unless you get a threshold of countries to cooperate, and that usually comes by incentivizing the poorer nations to join, and that's really diplomacy and aid deals and these sorts of things. I think this new administration in the U.S. Has more of a mentality that sees the logic in doing that. So I imagine there'll be upticking of signatories. Transparency, I think you look at VMS data as a perfect example. If tomorrow all that data was made transparent, suddenly you would have massive shift in these problems, because now we would have definitive proof of how many vessels, where they're going. There are lots of ways to game even VMS. You register one vessel, but you've got 9 under the same name, but still it would be a big boon. I do think there needs to be more countries that, including Japan perhaps, that publicly shares the data with the public, with journalists, with NGOs like Global Fishing Watch. And then the third point was port state control. Remind me, Masanori?
And subsidies.
Subsidies, my favorite. I think subsidies is a perfect example of, it's easy from an ocean conservation point of view to bang on subsidies, but if you try to have a more holistic view and think about developing nations and vulnerable populations and such, you start to understand a little bit more why places like India are very resistant to get on board, because there are very vulnerable sectors of society that depend on their subsidies. At the end of the day, though, unless the global community tackles subsidies and begins to discern between good and bad subsidies and leans on countries like Japan, like South Korea, like Norway, like Spain, like China, and like the US, to really pull away from subsidizing the bloated fleets, you're not going to be able to control the pace of overfishing. So I do think subsidies is a really valuable topic.
Okay, thank you. And Ida-san? Please unmute yourself.
Sorry, I got me. So very briefly, we needed to make pressure in the society and internationally to make some kind of incentives for the international, for the government do something about IUU, and also we needed to work in domestically to make our policy makers more active for this issue. That is needed to make some social pressure. That is why I said that the energy activity is very important. So by doing so, to do so that we needed more information, and we needed to make pressure on the buyers, sellers, as a daily consumers. And it sounds very much long way, but we needed to make some social pressure and in many aspects of the society. I think that is one of the reasons, one of the answer for your question, for all three questions. And that, as for the transparency, I want raise one issue, that the transshipment on the ocean. That things make the more things much more complicated, and things much more invisible. I know that Global Fishing Watch now working on the transshipment on the ocean to monitor using satellite data. We should put some focus on the transshipment activities on the ocean to make the fishing activities more transparent. That's a comment from me.
Thank you, Ida-san, and Tamura-san, please.
Thank you. So I think Ian and Ida-san already covered most of the things that I wanted to mention, but I was talking from the MSc assessment perspective, but like it's really, currently the 70% of the global seafood production in ocean is covered by MSc certification, but IUU is also like 15% of the global seafood production. So, even if I do like assessment like one by one, it's really one drop in the ocean, like in a vast ocean. And it's really, it's a chicken race to close the loopholes. But as we are talking, like we are now having more increased measures from like different perspectives. So, and, talking about the transparency, I think really it's the key. And I do think the key is like really the digitalizing and transforming all this, degree of the openness. So, like right now, even if we have some post-date measures, like the documents are paper-based, and it's so ineffective to actually see all the chain of the problems. So once we have more digitalized system to analyze in effective way, then I think it will change, with more, better speed.
So can I invite Professor Chisako Masuo to give us your comment on these elements?
Thank you very much for giving me the chance to make the final comment. I think C is the global commons, but it's very hard to have a good governance over the sea under the current international situations. There are so many sovereign countries and in different development degrees. So it is very important for us to develop a new a global governance system over the sea, which everybody can be happy about. China always had when Chinese people think about the maritime issues, they tend to hit upon the victimhood perceptions. They always have it because they have the very bitter memory on their own history, invaded mainly by the sea front. However, they today we have talked about China a lot, but they tend to request closed governance system controlled by its own authority, and I know that the Chinese government is trying to encourage many developing countries to use the Beidou satellite system and also Chinese VMS system, so that many people in the developing, they say that the many people in the developing countries can make use of it. Chinese VMS is a very good system. They can communicate with their families every time, all the time when they're in the fishing operation. And they can also make satellite telephones in a very cheap price, like 1 or 2 cents a minute. So it's a very attractive system they're developing. However, it's a very closed system. If they encourage many fishermen in the developing countries to use that system, they can gather information, global information on the maritime domain, and they can improve the accuracy of their satellite system, and if any security case happens, they can make use of it. I think we're in a very sensitive role, a sensitive junction, what kind of international system we are trying to develop in the future. And we really need to think of it very seriously at this moment. Thank you.
I do think it's legitimate because China is a big player, the biggest. But I think at the same time, we should, you looked at transparency, you looked at port state control. These are largely government type of fixes, and market, the companies, be they Japanese, be they South Korean, be they American, are bringing a lot of this fish to shore and selling it in hotels and schools and restaurants. And so we are all very much, all of our countries are very much involved in the supply chain. And so I think that really thinking about, number one, the leverage that the market and corporate players can play. I think also shining a really harsh light on the companies that are benefiting from these problematic behaviors, not just the governments and not just foreign governments, but our own governments, are also two things that we should be very mindful of in these discussions.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Totally agree.
So may I intervene that I totally agree with Ian. We need to put pressure on buyers, sellers in your country to do more, to be more transparent, to be more human rights conscious and environment conscious. We need to put pressure on buyers, sellers in our countries.
Thank you. And I now would like to invite Charlotte to make any message to the Japanese audience in particular, based on the discussion that we had for today.
To the Japanese audience, I would just encourage you to get inspired, get engaged, read, learn about what's happening in your nation's waters and in surrounding countries' waters, how that activity may be impacting the world's oceans. We're all connected. All of our supply chains travel by way of sea. And I would just encourage you to find organizations that inspire you, that can fuel you with knowledge to be a more informed consumer, a more informed participant, and to refrain from being complacent in these issues. Whether we realize it or not, our habits are feeding into a lot of the illegal activity that we've talked about today. And I think if you want to see a change, you can start with your own habits and the own choices that you make in your own life. You can engage with the music that we're producing on this music project. We have artists that are Japanese artists that you may already be fans of. By supporting and reading that sort of material, like the material that we produce at the Outlaw Ocean Project, you are contributing to a more just and sustainable ocean.
With this, I just come back to Ian for final remarks before we conclude. And anything you'd like to convey, particularly to the Japanese audience who are listening to this Ocean Forum?
No, I mean, I would just say I think Japan has a distinct history, both in terms of its fisheries science, both in terms of its management and policing of its own waters, and also just its consumption levels of seafood. It is a uniquely sophisticated and invested country and culture in these issues. And also, so many of the most successful things that Japan has done, I think, are worth the world watching and learning from. But I also think Japan has a really important role to play in kind of always setting the best example on these issues as well, and leading with new science and new policing and new research. So all things that you're already doing, but I would just say it's a great crowd to be talking to.
Okay, thank you, Ian, for wrapping up, and also thank you, Ida-san, Tamura-san, and Masuo-san for joining us, and also Charlotte to join us as well. So this bring us to conclude today's sessions on the IUU fishings in the perspective from the front line of IUU fishing, international partnership and challenges. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you very much for your attention. At OBRI, we distribute information about ocean policies from Japan and abroad, and also about changing international environment due to spread of COVID-19. We intend to offer information from the perspective of the ocean by publishing related observations, thoughts, as well as organizing events. Whenever you are interested, please take a look. Next Ocean Forum is scheduled in late March 2021. Details would be announced through our website or mail magazine. We are looking forward to have your participation again. Thank you.